Thank you for joining me for Session 9 in the Lifeway study of Ezekiel and Daniel. Our text is Daniel chapter 3, verse 14 to 26. The title is Demonstrate Allegiance, and the lesson summary statement is Believers must stand for God regardless of the potential cost. I'm using to introduce the lesson the idea that was on the goexplorethebible.com website. It's about fans who are inducted into the Football Hall of Fame, but there's a wing that's called the Ford Hall of Fans. I had never heard of that before. It's something they've started recently. And I went to the article that was suggested, I copied it off, and it tells us a little bit about each of the fans. And I'm going to give that information to 3 of the class members and just ask them to read it or to tell us about the particular fans that are considered to be in this Hall of Fans. And this person is announced at the Super Bowl who makes that particular hall. And the idea, of course, is their allegiance to the football team. And I'm asking the class, imagine how their allegiance has been tested over the years. And for the fans of these teams, of course, there were losing records and there was weather that was not very pleasant in order for them to attend. There's, of course, the expense of it. And then many of them dress up in very unusual costumes. And I'm sure there must have been something that was mockery or something of that nature. But they've become very popular with their teams and their fan base at this time. And from that, I want to talk about the lesson that these fans demonstrate allegiance. And the story that we're looking at in Daniel chapter 3 is a story of allegiance, or it's a loyalty test. Now, historians tell us that around 10 years after Nebuchadnezzar becomes king, that he is faced with a rebellion. And that could be the backdrop of what's happening in Daniel chapter 3 and the action that he takes in terms of building this golden statue, whether it's of him or whether it's of the god of Babylon, one of the gods of Babylon. He is asking and requiring the people a demonstration of their allegiance to him. That may be something in the background. According to Open Door USA, 13 Christians are murdered for following Jesus every day. We don't face that cost, of course, but many will still face tests of their allegiance to Jesus. So I want them to turn to the text in terms of our Sunday school lesson, beginning at chapter 3, verse 14 through 18, and just give a background as they're moving towards that in the sense of what's happening in the previous verses where the king has made this decision, and then the people give their allegiance to the king, and then those who are jealous of these 3 Hebrews reveal that they didn't give allegiance and bow and submission to this. And that's what's prepared this scene that we're going to be studying about here in chapter 3, verse 14. So I just want to read through the passage and begin to explain some of what's happening here. In verse 14, it says, Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? One of the things you'll notice about chapter 3 is its repetition. The names of these men are repeated over and over. The people who are leaders in the country, the full list is repeated over and over. The music and the instruments that are played are repeated, and then there's this sense of building up the intensity. But I want to ask the class, why do you think that Nebuchadnezzar keeps repeating the names of these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? How does that tie in with this conflict of allegiance? And what I'm wanting to lead the class to is these are their Babylonian names. And in a sense, Nebuchadnezzar is saying, you're Babylonians, you're not Jews any longer. And we saw last week their Babylonian names contained the names of the Babylonian gods. And so he's calling them to live as Babylonians and not as Jews, to fall in line as Babylonians. And then he says, why don't you serve my gods and worship the gold statue I have set up? Now here's the author playing with the ridiculousness of this. Imagine, here's a statue representing a god, and in the minds of many, it is the god. And what does Nebuchadnezzar have to do? He has to set the thing up. And so there's this man-made deity that they're being asked to worship. Verse 15 says, now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Now, what role does music play in movies? Can you imagine the Psycho movie and the theme where it's blaring as the lady is stabbed to death in the shower? I mean, the music just drives the terror of that scene. And here is something here that music is playing to intensify, maybe to exalt, make great this statue, and it's to be an intimidating factor. Did you know that the song that's played before the president enters the room, Hail to the Chief, began in 1844, I believe it was. John Polk was the president. His wife was his secretary, and she didn't think that it was very respectful that he would enter into a room and people wouldn't recognize him. He was rather short, and so he could be in a room for a few moments before people would recognize, oh, the president's in the room. So she's the one that started the practice of music being played before the president entered into the room. And so it has this tremendous influence upon us. He mentions the furnace. The furnace was the Babylonian way of killing the enemies, traitors, and criminals. And so this was a typical way for that to happen. So we'll have some discussion about that. And then I want to lead to this question. What is an idol? And ask the class to give me an answer for that. And it's anyone or anything that's elevated to a comparable place of importance with God. We constantly are struggling with idolatry. And what are the idols that we look to for rescuing us from our fears or from giving us significance? Because though we don't bow before golden statues, we are saturated with idolatry. Then verse 16 through 18, it's the Hebrew children that are speaking. In verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar. Now you'll notice they don't reply like in the earlier verses of this chapter when the people approached King Nebuchadnezzar and said, oh, may you live forever. They just simply address him as a man. There's no title here, King Nebuchadnezzar, nothing of that. Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then He can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and He can rescue us from the power of you, the King. Now, how would you paraphrase verse 17? And ask the class for that. What is it that they're saying? How would you paraphrase that? Now, they say that their God can rescue them. But what proof do they have of this? Where do they look to get an answer to say our God has the power to rescue us? And the things I'm looking for is like, well, the Exodus. He released them from and delivered them from the mighty power of Egypt. He led them through the Red Sea. Then there's the deliverance in Sinai, in which He provided food and He provided water and He provided shade. And then there's the deliverance of the Promised Land into the hands of Israel as they faced mighty nations that conspired against them, and yet this nation of slaves defeated those powerful warlike countries. there are many examples of it where this God is a God who rescues. But then there is their current reality. I mean, there's something to be said about the fact, well, he didn't rescue them from the Babylonians, and this king is the one who conquered the Judah king, and these people are living in a foreign country instead of living in their nations. And one of the things that could be viewed is, some people would interpret that as the Babylonian God conquered the Jewish God. So my point is where are they getting this idea that this God can deliver? And you can see that it comes from their history and from the scriptures, but it also comes from their understanding of what's happened, why God allowed their nation to be conquered, their king to be defeated. And it had to do with God's judgment. These people are used by God. They're under His control. Then verse 18, but even if He does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. Now, this is not a collapse of faith. It's not a matter of doubt when they say, but even if He does not rescue us. They're simply saying that we have faith in God, and our faith gives Him freedom to do as He pleases. Just suppose that you're the Apostle John, the disciple John, and your brother James has just been martyred. In the jail is Peter. The church is praying that God would release him, rescue him, save him, spare his life somehow. And then you learn of this miraculous event where Peter is released from prison by an angel and his life is spared. Now, my question is this. Why wouldn't you, if you were John, wouldn't you ask the question, why did my brother have to die and Peter be spared? How would you suppose John came to understand and to rationalize that? What I'm driving at here is it's this same issue. Our God can do these things. When we give Him the freedom to do what He feels is best. In the wisdom of God, it was James's purpose to live a testimony for Christ through martyrdom. It was Peter's purpose to continue to live and be a witness for Christ. So, in the future, we're going to know people who will be rescued, who will be healed, and who will not. What does that mean? God didn't have the power to rescue them or the power to heal them? No, He has the power. But He has the wisdom to know how it needs to be fulfilled, how it needs to be carried out. The deal that happens with us is that's where our allegiance is tested, and that's where our allegiance can be declared. The second point is persecution intensified. And again, I would read through this text and make some explanation. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and this is written in Aramaic, and the Aramaic word means intense heat, which is reflected in the heat of this furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary. And he commanded some of the best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. When they typically would kill a criminal or a traitor by tossing them into a furnace, they would strip them naked, like Jesus was stripped naked when He went to the cross. This is showing the intensity and the rage of Nebuchadnezzar, that he didn't even want to take time for that. And these men in their oriental costumes, their royalty, were bound together as they were to be thrown into the furnace, because this king was so enraged. Verse 22, since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In other words, the king who was having them thrown into the furnace couldn't protect his men, but the king that these three men served will protect them. Verse 23, and these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. So I would make some comments about these things, point out some various things, and then the question that I want to lead the class to in talking about persecution intensified is, we're told that America is becoming less Christian year by year. So how will a growing secular culture challenge our allegiance to Jesus Christ? One of the things I'm wanting them to see in asking that question is just the opposite of what happened with these men. Growing up in a growing secular culture, we're going to be pressured, we're going to be tempted to be weakened in our witness and our example of living for Christ. And these three men show us that living in a culture that is very anti-Christian, we can still live strong witnesses for Jesus Christ. That's what I'm wanting to point out about this issue of persecution intensified. As it grows more intense, so must our witness for Christ continue to be held strong and firm. The third point is God honored, verses 24 to 26. Again, I would read through and just make some explanations. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, didn't we throw three men bound into the fire? Yes, of course, your majesty, they replied to the king. He exclaimed, look, I see four men not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called out, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. I find it interesting that he didn't ask for the fourth person to come out of the fire, because he obviously had no control over that one. One of the things that's been pointed out about this text is all the text before, it emphasizes they were bound. But when they go into the fire, they're no longer bound. They're not tied, it says. So the fire, the only thing it burnt was what bound them. And there may be some truth that you may want to discuss with your class about that, in that sometimes these times of trials are the things that burn out of our life, the things that are hindering our witness and our experience with Christ. To honor someone is to give special recognition and value to the person. So how did the three Hebrews stand for God, bring honor to God? How did their allegiance, their undivided allegiance, regardless of the cost, how did it bring honor to God? And I'm looking for things like, well, the world saw the power of God through their lives. They saw how they were rescued by God. They saw that they had the presence of God with them. Just a number of things like that. When it comes to the conclusion of the lesson, there is an article by A.W. Tozer, just a portion of it, and I found this at the BereanCall.org. Berean is Berean, the BereanCall.org. It's an excerpt from A.W. Tozer. And I'm wanting to give a copy of this to the class, and it's this powerful description of the nail, the file, and the furnace. And let me just read one paragraph to you. It was the enraptured Rutherford who could shout in the midst of serious and painful trials, praise God for the hammer, the file, and the furnace. Here's the paragraph on the hammer. The hammer is a useful tool, but the nail, if it had feeling and intelligence, could present another side of the story. For the nail knows the hammer only as an opponent, a brutal, merciless enemy who lives to pound it into submission, to beat it down out of sight and clinch it into place. That's the nail's view of the hammer. And it's accurate except for one thing. The nail forgets that both it and the hammer are servants of the same workman. Let the nail but remember that the hammer is held by the workman, and all resentment toward it will disappear. The carpenter decides whose head will be beaten next and what hammer shall be used in the beating. That is his sovereign right. When the nail has surrendered to the will of the workman and has gotten a little glimpse of his benign plans for its future, it will yield to the hammer without complaint. And he goes on to give that same kind of conclusion when it comes to the file, which is more painful, and then to the furnace, which is most painful of all. I think your class would find something like this to be helpful to read again during the week. One of the things that I mentioned last week that's behind all of these lessons is the sovereignty of God. God is in control. And it's that knowledge that helps us to stand for God regardless of the potential cost. Because even though we may not see the outcome, we may not understand the reasons, we know He's a wise God. And He is a God that is moving things to accomplish His purposes, and He uses us in those purposes as well. It is a lesson that is needed by our people. It's a lesson that's going to be more and more needed as the days become less and less Christian. Thank you for teaching God's Word.